and really happy to be here with Peter, and we'll introduce ourselves in just a second. But as people are beginning to join, one of the things that I really like to know, since we can't see faces, is where are you in the world are you right now? Where are you? If you can drop that in the chat, we are very interested to know where in the world you're joining us from, and did you watch England? And you know, Yes, I know that they were playing the Dominican Republic of Congo. If you got my email and you're like, "Hey, they're not paying Côte d'Ivoire," it's because I thought stupidly COD stood for Côte d'Ivoire when it's the Democratic Republic of Congo. So that's why I was confused who they were playing, but I don't think anybody on here really cares. Oh, but there is somebody from the UK, so you were probably watching the football. I should hope so. Anyway, Harry Kane was brilliant in the game, so and it was a great game. All right, wonderful. Thanks for everyone signing in. And so I'm Christina Bieber Lake. I'm the one doing Art and Soul. And Peter's going to introduce himself in a second. I was a English professor for 25 years at Wheaton College. My subject was American literature. That was my specialty, with a specialty in Flannery O'Connor. But of course, I did a lot of women writers classes and often featured Jane Austen's Persuasion in my women writers class. So that is why we're bringing it into play today. Peter.
So hello, everyone. Good to have you here. I'm Peter Meilaender. Some of you know me from my bookshelf, my Substack newsletter. I teach political science at Houghton University, which is a small private Christian liberal arts school in Western New York. Just finished my 25th year there. After 25 years at a small place like Houghton, you teach a little bit of everything. So I'm kind of a jack of all trades, master of none, but I've done a lot of work in what we would call politics and literature. So reading literary texts, kind of the way you would read a text of political philosophy, looking for the political ideas in it. And so that's what I like to do at my Substack, and what I've done in some of my work, and what I'm looking forward to thinking about today.
Yes, that's so great. And I should say that I knew Peter's father well before I met Peter, Gil Meilaender. So those of you who know about the bioethics world and how long I've been kind of toying around with the bioethics world and wrote a book. I wouldn't say writing a book is toying around with, but that's how I met Peter's father, Gil, who is a wonderful scholar. And so when I was going to speak at Houghton, I was like, oh, let's connect, Peter, because I was doing a faculty retreat there. So that's how we connected with one another. But we're delighted to be working together because I've done this solo and I've done it with another person. It's very difficult to do it solo. We like to keep our eyes on the chat, and people have questions, comment at any time, because we've written a couple of sort of a game plan, but we're teachers. We don't well. Okay, so one of the things that Peter and I talking about is what surprised you the most in this particular reading? Because Peter had been a long time since he'd read it, and I taught it before, but every time I read a book in a different point in my life, something different comes out. So I thought that was a great place to start. So what surprised you the most, Peter?
And well, so as I said, as you mentioned, I wrote this to my subscribers. I have not read this in a long time, and haven't read any Austen in a long time. So had a vague recollection of the plot, but really nothing much more than that. And I think what has really stood out to me so far is the way in which, and I don't have this fully articulated yet, but the way in which Austen prompts us to evaluate the characters in her story. She's always, I think, inviting us to judge, to reach judgments about people and situations. But I would even take it a little step farther than that and say she invites us to sort of judge the judgments that they make. So we always see people reacting to each other, and we get a whole bunch of different perspectives in that sense. We get, Anne's perspective on different characters. We get her family members' perspectives on Anne. We get the Musgroves' perspectives on Wentworth, or Wentworth's perspectives on the Musgroves. And so we're always getting these kind of triangulations of different points of view. And yeah, there's this kind of interesting question, I guess, how do we get to know anybody? How do we figure out what's really going on inside anybody's head? How do we understand each other? And Austen is sort of inviting us to answer that question about the characters, but also making it a little hard to do that by forcing us to think about how we put together all those different angles. And there's a line, I made a little note, page 16. It's pretty, at least in the Penguin edition that we've got here, but page 16 is in chapter 2. And the narrator comments about a third of the way down the page, how quick come the reasons for approving what we like. And so we're always tempted to reach conclusions about the characters because of what we already think about things, as they are also, I think, about each other. And so Austen sort of alerts us to our biases, gives us different angles to try to check those biases. So yeah, that I found just the whole approach to thinking about these characters through this multiplicity of perspectives quite interesting.
Yeah, and it's in a lot of ways ahead of its time because that kind of psychological perspicuity, that kind of insight into the different characters that doesn't just come through their behavior or their dialogue, but has some interiority to it. Usually, it only really gets fully developed with Henry James and the sort of later 19th century stuff. So there's a little bit, I think, a little bit of an advanced perspective that Jane Austen is working with, and I think maybe even stronger in this novel than the other ones, which would make sense since it was the last
Yeah.
one. But so what surprised me in this reading, though, was just how foregrounded the, Sir Walter bit was. How very clearly what Austen is trying to do is tell you about Sir Walter way before she talks about, Anne Elliot, and so it's like Anne Elliot is kind of off stage for so long. So this is one of the things that I wanted to talk about with Peter, is why is that? Why is Austen spending so much time foregrounding Sir Walter Elliot and the Elliot baronetage and all that business, and keeping Anne Elliot kind of eclipsed for a little while? So let's talk about that.
Yeah. So bad. We obviously would love to hear your perspective on that too, Christina. I was struck reading it by how long it takes for Anne really to enter the action, right?
Mhm,
Um, if you think about the opening chapters, I see Grandma Mole in the chat. How quickly the story develops. So we learn a lot about the story, but Anne as a character doesn't get involved. So in the first chapter, we only hear a few things about her from family members, most of whom don't think terribly highly of her. Now, we're not encouraged to take their views maybe so seriously, but in the second chapter, we hear a little more about her, that time from the perspective of Lady Russell.
mhm,
In the third chapter, Anne speaks for the first time, but only says a few things, um, and mostly fairly non-committal things.
mhm, mhm,
In the fourth chapter, we get kind of the backstory of her broken off engagement with Wentworth, right? And only in chapter 5 does she finally kind of become involved as a participant in the action. So that's a fairly long time. In fact, I found myself even thinking as I read it, if I didn't already know something about the plot, if I couldn't look up a summary on Wikipedia, couldn't read a back cover blurb, how quickly, and I just started reading page 1, right? Sentence 1.
mhm,
How long would it take for me to realize that Anne Elliot was gonna be the central character? And it would take at least a couple of chapters, I think, to start to figure that out. And so why does she do that? I mean, I'm not entirely sure, but I think for me, it does circle back to some of that idea that we're being asked to evaluate different characters as we see them through the eyes of others.
mhm, mhm,
And so Anne, we don't just get Anne right off the bat. Here she
mhm,
is. This is what she's like. This is what she's doing. We learn what Sir Walter thinks about Anne, and we learn what Elizabeth thinks about Anne and Lady Russell. So we start to kind of build a picture of Anne, which we then have to test against the Anne that we actually find.
mhm.
And I think we could talk about this more. I think probably Anne matches the picture we get of her in some respects, but perhaps not in all. Right?
Well, I think in a lot of cases, it doesn't match at all, and I think there are lots of different reasons why Austen would do this, and it reminds me of Faulkner, again, talking about ahead of your time, where it's like you get something like The Sound of the Fury, where the main character is absolute center of the novel, but doesn't speak. Also in As I Lay Dying, doesn't really speak, has only 1 chapter. It's because all these other perspectives, you're seeing that this Anne's life is constructed by other people's perspectives, um, and has a lot of little say. and so and part of it is being a woman and, being in this financially strapped situation, all of those things makes you don't have a lot to say about your life, and I think Austen's trying to help us to understand that that's the case, that you're at the mercy of how other people see you in very real sense. Your agency is kind of limited, and I think that she's trying to stress that. The other thing that's interesting to me is that, you're trying to displace the whole idea of the romance, right? Which is
Mm.
definitely from the main character's perspective, right? I've had this romance and, and I feel this and I felt that and all that. And Austen is less interested in that story than she is in the social conventions and the the whole narrative around Anne. So that is something that you said, Peter, that you really wanted to talk about too was this relationship between nature and convention that is something that she's trying to foreground here for us. And part of the reason way that you foreground it is by not having it be only about Anne, right, or from her perspective. So that's at least part of the reason why it's going on. But
I was one of the phrases you just used, Christina, I was struck by. You said that Anne is, constructed by other people's
yeah,
perspectives on her. Could you just elaborate on that a little bit?
well, this is a very English PhD thing to say, right? That
Mhm.
that we're all to some degree constructed by what people say around us, right? Like they triangulate on us all the time, and you don't have a lot of say in how people perceive you, right? You can only do what you can do, and so be consistent with yourself, and and hope that people see you correctly. Because I think so much of what we learn about Anne is that I think, now this is debatable. When Wentworth comes back, I think she misreads him. And this is one of the chapters that we're going to talk about later on at the end of chapter 7. This is one of my favorite passages because she's just all like interpreting stuff that he said about her in a way that I don't think he meant. Right, but we are doing that all the time. We're constantly interpreting other people's behaviors, and Austen wants us to understand. So in that way, she's constructed, by other people's
Yeah,
perspectives.
you got at least one person who agrees with you in the comments, right?
Okay, oh,
Um,
thanks.
I think you could even push that a step farther though and connect it to the title, right? And this idea of
Yes. Yeah.
persuasion. So we know Anne has been persuaded in the past, um, perhaps against her better judgment. Certainly looking back retrospectively, she regrets that she had
Mhm,
let herself doesn't blame herself, she says, but she regrets having let
mhm,
herself be persuaded. So this idea of being constructed by what other people think about you, right?
mhm.
Being in some way malleable, formed by that. To be
Yes.
persuaded is also to be malleable, right? To be shaped by those points of view around you. And so there is something about Anne when we were led to ask, how to what extent is she firm, to use another word that comes in quite a bit as a characteristic that some people admire in the book? To what
Yeah.
extent does she have an independent mind, and to what extent is she like persuadable?
Yeah, and for not, forgetting that 19-year-old woman, right? Like, in England at a time when, women's voices were just not as given that much weight or importance, and in a family with a lot of big voices, Sir Walter Elliot, and the children that are like him, Elizabeth especially, very much like him, and so she's already of a character who's more quiet, right? And
Yes.
so and
Mhm.
what is so fascinating about this novel is that Jane Austen wants us to understand that it's a good characteristic to be persuadable, right? Like you need to be able to be open to wisdom that other people have, but it's also can be a problem if you're too persuadable, right? And she's able to walk that line brilliantly. And so I thought, just when you were talking, Peter, page 29, this is one of the most important couple few paragraphs in the novel, right? So I thought we could read them and talk about them. And any of y'all want to chime in who are listening. Um, and this is 29, which is chapter 4 for those of you who are doing a different edition. So it's talking about Lady Russell and Anne and their relationship. And this is chapter 4, right? We don't even get to these until this, 4 chapters in. They knew not each other's opinion. either its constancy or its change on the one leading point of Anne's conduct, for the subject was never alluded to. I mean, again, very British, right? Like, we're not going to talk about that. That's in the past. We're not even going to bring it up, which is interesting. But Anne, at 7 and 20, thought very differently from what she had been made to think at 19, right? Very interesting choice. Made to think at 19. She did not blame Lady Russell. She did not blame herself for having been guided by her. But she felt that were any young person in similar circumstances to apply to her for counsel, they would never receive any such certain immediate wretchedness, such uncertain future good. That's some pretty strong language coming out of Anne. She was persuaded that under every disadvantage of disapprobation at home and every anxiety attending his profession, all their probable fears, delays, and disappointments, she should yet have been a happier woman in maintaining the engagement than she had been in the sacrifice of it. And this, she fully believed, had the usual share, had even more than an usual share of all such solicitudes and suspense than theirs, without reference to the actual results of their case, which, as it happened, would have bestowed earlier prosperity than could be reasonably calculated on. Okay. All that's a lot of words to say. He did well. And she now, the questions that Lady Russell had about him had been answered. And turns out, yeah, I was right about him. He managed to do it. Right. He distinguished himself, and it says he got a handsome fortune, and he is quite rich. Like, I Believer magazine did this whole thing about different characters in literature and how much their fortune would translate into current. It's like millions of dollars that he. So just so you know, she could not doubt his being rich, and in favor of his constancy, she had no reason to believe him married. And then this paragraph. So, Peter, I'd like to hear your thoughts on this. How eloquent could Anne Elliot have been? How eloquent, at least, were her wishes on the side of early warm attachment and a cheerful confidence in futurity against that over-anxious caution which seems to insult exertion and distrust Providence. She had been forced into prudence in her youth. She learned romance as she grew older, the natural sequel of an unnatural beginning. I mean, we could write a whole book just on that last sentence. But how do you read this, Peter?
Yeah, well, so I underline too much when I
Yeah.
read, but that's my bottom paragraph there. You can see the double
Pencil, but yeah.
So we had exactly the same spot flight. I mean, two things from that last paragraph, especially. Right? Well, let me back up. Where you started reading, I do think, and you had some discussion of this in your post and in the questions and comments that came in response. People picked up on that. I think it's really interesting that Austen says that Anne blamed neither Lady Russell nor herself for being persuaded by Lady Russell. So, like, Lady Russell was doing what Lady Russell was supposed to do by giving the best advice she could to this young woman who was in some way under her charge. Anne, looking back, also thinks she was doing sort of what she was supposed to do by attending to the wisdom of this older mentor. Nevertheless, they got it wrong. She now thinks, right? And if anybody came to her now asking for advice, she would give very different advice, which is a really interesting comment. And then when we get to the end there, at the bottom of the page, the last part of what you read, that last sentence in particular, well, I love the sentence about distrusting Providence, right?
Yes, right.
But then she'd been forced into prudence in her youth. And prudence is an interesting word. It seems to be used frequently in this novel to mean something like caution. But of course, it's also the name for kind of the chief of the cardinal virtues traditionally. And I think Austen has maybe a lot to teach us about prudence in that sense. So she'd been forced into prudence, into caution in her youth. She learned romance as she grew older, the natural sequel of a unnatural beginning. So she learned romance older. Now, you had commented just, 5-10 minutes ago on Austen sort of displacing some of the trappings of conventional romance. But we do see Anne, I guess for want of a better word, I'll say swooning from time to time.
Yes, we do. She's fallen for him completely.
Exactly. And in that chapter 4, which is the first time she speaks again, she has three sort of say brief non-committal remarks. One of them I think quite interesting, but to the group. And then her fourth and final comment in that chapter is the very last sentence, and it's after everybody else is gone, she's on her own. She thinks soon he'll be here. I think the he is italics. He'll be here, right?
Yeah.
And so
Mm.
she has this kind of romantic sense, but it's the natural sequel of an unnatural being. So she was forced to be overly conventional when she was young. It
Mhm,
appears to be a suggestion when she should have listened a little more to the instincts of nature in her.
mhm,
And because those natural impulses were squelched is too strong a word, but were suppressed a little bit,
mhm, mhm,
um, now they rear their head later.
mhm,
But that, the whole framing there, it does raise this question. So you mentioned before, it is something I'm really interested in the book. What is the relation between what we would traditionally, in the way we talk about these things, call nature and convention, right? What comes from us? What comes from society
mhm,
around us? And that passage sort of highlights that issue. Um, as does, I think there's a lot of concern in what we're reading with what it means to be, I don't have a good gender neutral word, but a gentleman, right? Gentlewoman, gentle person. Um, that ideal of conduct
mhm,
that is so important, which involves some social graces and
mhm.
attention to the
Manners.
way we do things,
Mhm,
right?
mhm,
But also an ability to kind of see through those and understand what's going on beneath the surface.
mhm,
I think the discussion of the Navy is often very interesting.
mhm,
The naval officers who come from an extremely ordered, conventional
mhm,
life, right?
mhm,
Life on a ship is extremely governed by convention.
mhm,
Um, but they are very warm, generous, outgoing persons.
mhm.
They have a real ability to connect with people. I love this scene. I'm forgetting which chapter it is, but when we meet the Harvilles,
Yes.
later, and when we when we're sort of invited into their house, right? They invite everybody in, and there's this wonderful description of how welcome they make everybody feel, how
Mhm,
prepared they are to feed everybody, of sort of the interior furnishings. Even they have this small space, but have done the best they could to make it comfortable. It's a wonderful image of
mhm,
sort of taking, um, that image of furnishing, right? It's a wonderful image of building on something that is within the human spirit, right? This
mhm,
desire for a kind of comfort, but domesticating it, which is then
mhm,
always shaped by convention and custom. So I
mhm.
just so many ways in which that keeps coming back. And that passage that you were just pointing to, that line at the bottom of 29, is one where Austin really flags it for us.
Mhm.
But no,
Yeah.
I went on for a long time. So tell me what you
No,
like.
no.
You picked the page,
I
yeah.
the Navy thing that, the way that Sir Walter just assumed his view of the naval officer, it's just like they came about this money all the wrong way, as if he got it somehow the right way. Right, I mean, and somehow that, you know, is a revelatory of bad character, in a naval officer or whatever, and it's so ridiculous, like, it's just so patently wrong, and Anne knows it, and of course, the book is through Anne's perspective, the free and direct discourse, so you know that Anne has already figured that out, and don't forget Jane Austen brothers were in the Navy, and so she was very close to, understanding this whole world, and the money that they kinda came into, was because of the war, so it's the spoils of war that they have that kind of money, but Sir Walter writes off his character for all the wrong reasons, Wentworth's character, for all the wrong reasons. So, by listening to Lady Russell does not write off his character the same way that Sir Walter does, but Lady Russell also knows that Anne is the daughter of Sir Walter, and, there's just certain things, it's like, you don't wanna risk, upsetting the fruit basket in a family too much, and, so those things are going on there too. But this idea of convention and I'm particularly interested in manners, right? Because I
Mhm.
think it's Hume, the philosopher, who says that we tend to think of manners as just external behaviors, right? But when you inhabit these behaviors, that you become more and more the virtues that those behaviors represent. If you give money away, you become a more generous person. Like you inhabit the virtues. Um, And prudence definitely is one of those virtues, but gentlemanly behavior, right? Where you do the right thing. Because this book, like Emma, which I had just read in my book group recently, so it's on my mind, you find out about a person not from what they say or even from like their manners when they behave in a social setting, but how they behaved, right? Like what when action is required, what they do. And in Emma, it's like I got the carriage without being asked, I helped somebody out here. And Wentworth kind of has this faulty moment where he's just, remember when he's like trying to play with at the end of this section, he's playing with Louisa and,
Yeah,
she
right.
cracked her head or whatever. This is the example of a dramatic moment when you're dealing with a domestic novel. It's like she cracked her head. Oh,
Concussion. Yeah, right.
right, as opposed to War and Peace where the dramatic moment. But it's so fascinating because guess who, responds the best? I just threw my pencil. Anne. She has the best behavior and Wentworth, doesn't quite prove himself in that moment. I mean, I don't know what you think about Peter, but I'd feel like, I'm not, sure of him yet. Uh,
Yeah. Yeah.
yeah.
He seems, unable to act. It's the first time we see him that way, but
Mhm,
he always seems in control, right? Um, Always seems to be master of the situation, knows what to say to different people,
right.
makes people feel, at ease in his presence, very
Mhm.
different kinds of people even. But at that moment, he seems totally, unmanned, if we can
Mhm, yeah,
put it that
yeah.
way. And
'Cause he
he's
felt
sort of
guilty. I did this, I dropped her.
yeah,
Yeah,
yeah. Um,
yeah. It's I just
and I, on the one hand, I suppose I get I don't want to be too hard on him because it must have been pretty horrifying, and he's thinking about her and about her parents and all these things, but he doesn't respond very effectively,
mhm,
and seems to look to Anne. I mean, one thing we can say about Anne, I think, is that she is somebody people look to,
mhm,
somebody people expect to be able to take control of a situation.
mhm. Yeah.
Um, yeah.
So
Can I
this
just one I did since you had mentioned, in respect to the Navy, Sir Walter's completely dismissive opinion.
yeah,
I mean, he dismissed Wentworth as a suitor, right? He's not a
yeah.
gentleman, and then when he's gonna get a tenant, and learns that it could be somebody in the Navy, he's got wants nothing to do with the Navy, and it's really interesting that that's Anne's first comment in the book is, um,
Oh, is
when
that your actual first comment, the
well
first
well,
words?
it's respect to with respect to that because
Okay.
Mr. Shepherd, the agent, says he's got this possible tenant, on
Yeah.
sort of in line, and Sir Walter, um, says he's not very disposed to offer special favors to any tenant, even if it's a sailor or a soldier. And there's this kind of pause, in the conversation, and Anne says her first words, "The Navy, I think, who have done so much for us," thinking of the war, "have at least an equal claim with any other set of men for all the comforts and all the privileges which any home can give." Right? So, like,
Yeah.
it's a kind of an assertion of a basic human equality there, right?
Yeah.
Or at least you merit what you get through your actions and the kind of person you are. I just think it's really interesting that the first thing she does is to come to the defense of the Navy, a conventional institution, in the name of nature,
Yeah.
because they're some natural gentlemen, right?
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Well, it's so interesting too, thinking about, just Anne's like, "I don't blame Lady Russell, and I don't blame myself, for not doing that." And I think some of what maybe Austen wants us to see is that Anne I would argue, and I did argue in my article that she is going to make a better marriage having had to wait and figure this whole thing out and deal with her own emotions and disappointment and stuff like that than she would have otherwise. Now, I don't know. What do you think?
Well, let me this isn't exactly saying what I think, but let me push you on it just a little bit
Yeah,
more.
yeah,
This is
do.
gonna make a better marriage. Certainly could make a better marriage, and certainly has the benefit of experiences that could improve her judgment in trying to make a better marriage.
Mhm.
On the other hand, um, she hasn't shown any signs since then of making one at all, the people around her are Lady Russell, we're told, is beginning to be concerned. She thinks Anne is well suited to marriage, it says at one point, but sees no likelihood on the horizon and has turned down one suitor, right? Because Charles Musgrove came to her before proposing
Right.
to Mary. So, I mean, if you simply say, is she in a better position to make a good marriage? Um, yes, perhaps, right? Uh, but is there any sign that she will? Not necessarily, and
Not yet, not
it
yet.
takes some luck, right?
It does.
Captain Wentworth shows up. I guess we'll see what happens, but yeah,
Well, and I wanted to, Nancy, one of my former students, got on there and said
uh,
this, "I do wonder where we draw the line between wise caution and fear. Is Lady Russell's worry that Anne will repeat her mother's mistake wise caution or fear?" And I think that's a really interesting question, right? Because we, especially as Americans, right, like we're more afraid of losing our independence and our this decision, to do whatever we want to do than we are of making an imprudent choice. So I mean, our biases as Americans is strongly on the side of, don't be afraid, just follow your heart, follow your bliss, right? And I feel like Austin is interrogating that position quite strongly,
mhm.
you know.
Yeah, well, I think that's right, and so I mean, maybe I'll take my cue from Sharon's
Right.
comment here
Yeah.
that it could it be both? And I do think it's both, but it's 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 a little trickier than just a combination of both, I think. So the question you had read back from Nancy,
Mhm.
how do we draw the line between caution and fear?
Mhm.
And it's not just a matter of line drawing, right? Because what looks like caution in one circumstance looks like fear in another. What looks like prudence in one circumstance looks like fear in another. And I think we get the exact same thing in the story with a quality like firmness,
Mhm.
which
Yeah.
Wentworth, in an important passage, praises in a consequential passage, also praises highly. He values firmness, right? Sticking to your guns, sticking, not swaying because of other people's opinions, right? But holding true to that, which is also kind of very American Sinatra singing I
Yeah,
did it my
right.
way, right? In the background. But that firmness, what looks like firmness in one context looks like folly in another,
Huh?
or pride, right? In another, or stubbornness. And so I think that Austin is really challenging us to think very hard about what goes into the quality of what we might just call good judgment, right?
Yeah.
How do you become the kind of person who can distinguish and know when, a certain mode of behavior is prudently cautious and when it is, like imprudently cautious or
Mhm,
fear?
mhm.
There's a line I had it in mind as one of my possible favorite passages from the first part.
Alright,
I'll use
great.
it now, and, uh, and, come up with something else later if I need to, but on the next to last page that we read, the very end, it's 108, it's Anne is reflecting on Wentworth, Wentworth had told Louisa earlier he values firmness about everything, right? And Louisa kind of takes that lesson to heart and immediately becomes pig-headed and won't change her mind about anything. And
Yeah,
this leads to her accident, right? Because she refuses to kind of be cautious and wants to jump down off these steps.
right.
So she gets it. So that Anne is thinking about that, and she thinks to herself, Anne wondered whether it ever occurred to him, to Wentworth, now to question the justness of his own previous opinion as to the universal felicity and advantage of firmness of character, and whether it might not strike him that, like all other qualities of the mind, it should have its proportions and limits. And that just jumped, that idea that all qualities have their proportions and limits
Mhm.
just seemed very Austenian to me, if I can put it that way.
Aristotelian, I know that,
Yes, that's right. I think there's a lot of Aristotle going on back there.
yeah, a lot of Aristotle, and at the time too, right? Aristotle's kind of, well, when you think about a mannered society, that's what you get. You get these means, these virtues between the means, the mean between the extremes, being in play there. And it, also, it just occurred to me when you were talking too that Wentworth had that scene earlier that the Gillian Beer had focused on, where the child who is expected, is going to act like a child, jumps on her back and starts to sort of strangle her, and it's this awkward situation, and he steps in and just behaves the way that somebody who has solicitude care for somebody else should behave, right?
Mhm.
And so that's an example of the behavior thing that I was talking about earlier, being the judge of character. Like, that's how you judge people's character. That's how you make proper judgments. And so being prudent about marrying somebody, to go back to the question of prudence in making a decision about committing to someone in marriage, the prudent thing to do is to make sure you know the person's character. you know, um, and so there, I think when Anne was 19, there's nothing to suggest that was fully proven at by Captain Wentworth
Mhm.
at the time.
Mhm.
Oh,
Sure.
and so she now gets not only a second chance at him, but a second chance to see, is he really who I think who I thought he was? Not just with regard to fortune. I mean, that's,
Right.
important too, but just his person.
Yeah.
So, so I don't see that as fearful. It's at all in that regard. But I think your point is an excellent one, that what is sometimes prudent thing is to have fear. Actually, sometimes the prudent thing is to be afraid. Uh,
But I
uh,
I do I always and I thought about it when I read your post also. I
yeah,
come back to that page 29 where you read the long passage
yeah,
before, and I think we can't overlook the fact that Anne, what is it, 9 years later? So almost a decade later, as she looks back, thinks she was overcautious.
yeah, yeah,
Um, and so I don't wanna dismiss that.
right.
So, I mean, she could be wrong, of course, right? It's possible that looking back, she's over optimistic about her younger ability to make a good choice. But yeah, Austen does go out of her way to tell us that Anne, and I just, the fact that Anne says, I would give somebody else different advice, that to me is a
Yeah.
really interesting observation.
It is a really interesting observation, but she's still extremely young woman
Yep.
and not married at the time, right?
Yep.
Making that observation. So, and this is part of the reason why the novel is so fascinating, right? Is that Austen never married herself. She refused some suitors, and had did not. And Gillian Beer points all this out in the introduction that we had, uh, and had been sought upon to give advice in somebody else's, marriage situation and all these things, and recognizes this is just not a simple calculus. It's not some simple, like, follow your bliss, follow your heart, and then you'll make the right decision. And yet she doesn't want to leave. Well, the way I put it in my post was, she didn't want a Thomas Hardy, Anne Elliot, like, because if this is a Thomas Hardy novel, then she's destroyed from the outset. And all the bad things will happen, but that's not the way that Jane Austen sees the world. I think there's a little bit of trust in providence, but that's a deeper trust in providence than what even the young Anne Elliot thought. It's a deeper,
Mhm.
like, to try to do the right thing, to try to be prudent, to try to make good, prudent choices. Providence rewards you. God rewards you, I think, is the way that Austen. I I don't know. I mean, I'm not an Austen scholar, but that's the way
Yeah.
it
Yeah.
seems like he sees the world.
Well, maybe we should come back to that question when we get to the end of the novel.
Yeah. Yes. Well,
What
that's a
what is it? What does it look like?
yeah.
What I mean, I think for me, looking forward, what do people need to learn? Right? What do the
Yeah.
different characters need to learn, and will they learn those things? Is really interesting. Just somebody's put a longer comment in the chat there.
Yeah. That's
Um,
Natalie, one of my former students. Hi, Natalie.
okay, thinking prospectively about future choices, why we're led to how she would advise a younger self. Yeah, not primarily about. I think it's important. It's not about vindication of blame, but what would we do in the future? What have we learned? How would that affect the kind of advice we're going to give next time? And Anne has some opinions she's formed about the kind of advice she would give next time. It's not the same as the advice she got. Hmm.
Yeah, that's right. And therefore, there's a kind of a well, we could talk about what Anne learns, like, through these last several years, and this is a novel a lot about her growth and development as a person, and and she's just having to kind of work through all of these issues, how would I work through how would I advise the next person? And that's why, again, I just think the reason why this novel is so good is because of her not blaming, even at this young age, still not blaming Lady Russell, because she recognizes that Lady Russell was doing the best with what she had to try to love her, you know? So
Maybe if I could, so that question of what has Anne learned so far? So we're only halfway through, right?
yeah, yeah,
Um,
yeah.
but I would love to hear you say a little more about that, and maybe, thinking in a couple of respects. One, there's an opportunity for you to circle back to a point you made earlier about Anne misjudging Wentworth. So,
Mhm.
what has she learned or not learned that makes her misjudge him? I also think, I mean, Anne is in many respects admirable, but she does have some of what's called the Elliot pride at one
Yes,
point.
yes.
Um,
She's not completely immune to
she's
the
not.
Elliot side, and it
Yeah.
would be weird if she was, okay?
Yeah.
Uh,
But
right?
so she and she seems to have. So part of us wants her to be romantically faithful to Wentworth until the day he comes back into her life again, right? But she does seem to have reached a conclusion that she had her chance at love and she missed it, and she's not gonna try again, which
Which is
doesn't
wrong.
necessarily seem like the right conclusion, right?
It's not.
Um, and
That's
so
that's flat out wrong.
there's a
Right, it's
kind
like
of.
sort of a
Yeah.
vindictiveness almost, self against yourself, oddly enough.
And there is
Yeah.
a little bit of, I mean, I think Anne takes some pleasure in, I don't wanna say she takes pleasure in suffering, that's not quite right. Sacrifice. She takes some pleasure in sacrificing for others, which is, again, one of the qualities that we can look at in 2 ways. I mean, in some ways, that's a very admirable thing, but in some ways, it may lead her to make some bad decisions. So I would, anything in there that you would care to respond to it?
No, I think that's a really good point, that she has a little bit of pride in her seeing herself as this sacrificial person, and I put myself on the altar, like I've sacrificed myself, and that actually feeds in really nicely with the passage that I wanted to take a very close look at the chapter 7, and Cynthia, my former colleague, right, perhaps she's learning more about Lady Russell than about herself. Yes, right, like, and Lady Russell, this is why I think there's so much about the friendship between Lady Russell and the mother, and also, like,
Hmm.
being a mother myself now, I read it differently than when I was, a younger woman, and recognizing the sense of responsibility that Lady Russell had felt to Anne's mother. You know, Anne is left without a mother and left with a horrible father, and so and Lady Russell being a godmother figure is in a really tough position when you think about it, right? So, erring on the side of caution, uh, I think maybe that's why Anne doesn't take her out, because I mean, doesn't blame her. It's like, "I'm erring on the side of caution." Um, anyway, 50s, and this is why, to go back to what we were talking about, Peter, it's so dangerous that that Anne doesn't see her own kind of pride in her, "I'm a sacrificing my entire bloom of my youth," and she doesn't see herself that way, but that's really what she's doing. And this is it feeds into her misreading of the Captain Wentworth moment when he first comes on the scene, and that's why I wanted to talk about this passage. So, it's in chapter 7, if you have a different edition, page 56 and 57, if you're following along in ours. So, okay, she just to remind you of what the scene is, this is the first time that Captain Wentworth has showed up, right? And she hears about him, and she's all, like, stressed about having to see him, and she's, it's over," she repeated to herself again and again in nervous gratitude, "The worst is over," like, I've gotten through this moment. Um, okay, so soon, however, they had once more been in the same room, she says. And as she says, soon, however, she began to reason with herself and try to be feeling less. Okay. She recognizes she's responding completely out of her emotions here. 8 years, almost 8 years had passed since all had been given up. How absurd to be resuming the agitation with such an interval had vanished into distance and indistinctness. What might not 8 years do? Events of every description, changes, alienations, removals, uh, all must be compromised in it. An oblivion of the past, how natural, how certain too. It included nearly a third part of her own life, which that's a really short period of time, you know. I mean, because I mean, I'm just saying that's how young she is. It seems young to me. Alas, with all her reasonings, she found that to retentive feelings, 8 years may be little more than nothing. Now, how were his sentiments to be read? This is the moment where she's, like, recognizing, I have to interpret his behavior.
Let me just chime in real I love just that question,
Yeah.
um, I think resonates even be so it leads us into what you are interested in, but the question of how we read people's sentiments
Yes.
is important for everybody throughout the book, right?
Yes.
Go ahead.
Exactly so, and again, this is what Henry James, like, picks up and goes, through the roof with. Was this like wishing to avoid her? And the next moment, I mean, was this like wishing to avoid her? I mean, that's the way she's interpreting it, but I don't think it is. I don't think that's what he's doing. And the next moment, she was hating herself for the folly which asked the question. On one other question, which perhaps her utmost wisdom might not have prevented, she was soon spared all suspense, for after the Miss Musgroves had returned and finished their visit at the cottage, she had this spontaneous information from Mary. Captain Wentworth is not very gallant by you, Anne, though he was so attentive to me. Now, hello, Mary is not a reliable witness, right? Of what Captain Wentworth's feelings and how to interpret his sentiments, right? But so Henrietta asked him what he thought of you when they went away, and he said you were so altered he should not have known you again. Okay. Now, this is what I find so interesting is how she interprets this. Because altered could be altered for the better, right? It doesn't mean altered for the worse, but that is the way she interprets it, right? Mary had no feelings to make her respect her sisters in a common way, but she was perfectly unsuspicious of inflicting any peculiar wound. Of course not. Altered beyond his knowledge, Anne fully submitted in silent, deep mortification. Doubtless it was so, and she could take no revenge, for he was not altered, or not for the worse. She had already acknowledged it to herself, and she could not think differently, let him think of her as he would. No, the years which had destroyed her youth and bloom had only given him a more glowing, manly, open look, in no respect lessening his personal advantages. She had seen the same Frederick Wentworth. And I'm just like, no, that there is no reason to believe that that's what he thinks. Not to mention the fact that she is actually in the full bloom, of her beauty. As I think women are more beautiful at 29 than they are at 19. Okay, and there's no reason to believe that that Austen thinks otherwise. But my goodness, look, so altered that he should not have known her again. These were words which could not but dwell with her. Yet she soon began to rejoice that she had heard them. They were of sobering tendency. They allayed agitation. They composed and consequently must make her happier. Frederick Wentworth had used such words or something like them, but without an idea that they would be carried round to her. He had thought her wretchedly altered, and in the first moment of appeal had spoken as he felt. He had not forgiven Anne Elliot. This is all her interpretation. Right? We have no reason to believe that this is what he thought. Right? She is just berating herself. And there's a way in which when see yourself as I've sacrificed my bloom, I did all these things, there's pride. Right? And this is what Anne Elliot has to learn to get beyond, I think. And I think she does. I think she grows through the course of
Mhm,
the novel.
mhm.
If any of you who are listening have an opinion on that, I'd love to hear that too. Um, but this is the first time I think that I've paid this much attention to her early interpretation of Wentworth's reappearance in her life. Self-talk, dangerous dialogue. Yes. Yes. And she is what's the word? I'm indulging in it.
Yeah,
She's indulging in it.
I think so. You pointed out there's no evidence. We have no evidence to suggest that her interpretation is correct.
Mhm.
We don't know that. I mean, Austin kind of lets us ask the question, right? I mean,
That's
it's it's not it's not an implausible interpretation in the sense that, and a little farther down the same page, she talks about the contrast between the feebleness of character she thinks she had showed earlier
right.
compared to his own decided, confident temper. So she kind of knows what kind of a guy he is and what he
Yeah,
admires, and she thinks she fell short, right? So she
yeah,
has sort of plausible reason for this, but nevertheless gives to very slender evidence, a very negative interpretation.
mhm, mhm.
And I think it's important. There's another really similar paragraph on page 84 in chapter 10, which I think is a really interesting chapter in a lot of ways. It's when he puts her into the carriage
Yeah,
and she thinks the same sort of thing. And it even says she understood him, right? So she's reading all of this into it. She understood him. He could not forgive her, but he could not be unfeeling.
yeah,
Right? See, he's gonna be polite and courteous because he's a polite and courteous person, but
right.
he can't overlook what she but again, that's all Anne, right?
It's
We
all
have
in your
no
head.
reason for that,
Uh-huh.
and so she does, she takes a little bit of pleasure
Yeah, and
in
self-defense. Yeah, the comments, right, perhaps it's self-defense. Maybe it's simpler for her to assume Wentworth
yeah,
thinks negatively about well,
yeah,
it does, more protective, right? Talk about
yeah,
fear, because
mhm,
then it's just like, I'm not gonna get rejected a second time. I mean, I'm pre being rejected by you. I'm pre being rejected by you, and so I'm safer, than if you reject me later, right? Because I've already experienced your rejection.
yeah, and for all of her apparent self-possession, and kind of rational control of situations, she's constantly every time he enters a room, right, she's all aflutter and can hardly control herself.
Mhm.
So we know she still has these strong
Mhm.
feelings even if she denies them, and so that suggestion of it as a kind of defense mechanism makes a lot of sense,
Yeah,
right?
I think that's good, a good interpretation. And again, it's like, uh, well, given and this is something that's a big theme that I develop in Art and Soul in general and all the conversations that we have, um, is this self-blindness, right? Like, what does it take to really see those areas, to recognize you're blind to your blind and then how do you act when you know you're blind to your blind spots,
Mm.
right? Well, one of the ways that you do is by trusting somebody else who loves you, right? When you know you're blind to your blind spots, then you want to trust somebody else's read on a situation that you know that you could have wrong, you know? So that's why I keep seeing this kind of tension that Austin is building with Anne Elliot's self-discovery, you know?
Could I
Yeah,
maybe
she's
take
not
that
acknowledging yeah, with yeah,
I was just if I could take that idea of, blind spots and the difficulty of kinda knowing yourself and
mhm,
looking toward other people's opinions for some guidance, although those could be mistaken too. Maybe I can
mhm,
use that just as a kinda lead into one section of the reading that I particularly,
yeah,
enjoyed. It's not just a passage, but I really do think chapter 10 as a whole is a remarkable chapter. Um, this is where they all go for the walk together,
mhm,
right?
mhm,
And Henrietta's gonna go, and find the curate, to kind of reconnect with him, but there's just a number of things in that chapter 10 that I think loop together in a really remarkable way. So just a few examples, page 78 near the top, there's what I think this is a great example of the indirect, free indirect discourse you had mentioned. We sort of change perspectives in the middle of a sentence.
mhm,
Um, there's a sentence just 5 or 6 lines down. her pleasure is italicized, her
Mhm.
pleasure in the walk must arise from the exercise in the day, from the view of the last smiles of the year upon the tawny leaves and withered hedges, and from repeating to herself some few of the thousand poetical descriptions extant of autumn, that season of peculiar and inexhaustible influence on the mind of taste and tenderness, that season which has drawn from every poet worthy of being read some attempt at description or some lines of feeling. It's like the beginning of that sentence, I think we're in Anne's head, right?
Mhm. Yes,
Her
we
right,
are.
that italicized emphasis, she's thinking this, I can only take pleasure, not from the walk, not from the sorry, not from the company, right?
Mm.
The walk, the exercise, the day, I can take pleasure in that. But then somewhere in the next half sentence or so, we're outside of her head again, and the narrator is telling us the kinds of things she's thinking about all these sort of autumnal metaphors about the end of life, which gives us this sense of her mood. Um, so we're getting this kind of interesting look inside her, and then within a few pages, she's overhearing the conversation, the really crucial conversation between Wentworth and Louisa. Right? Um,
Yes.
he says to, and so she's out of sight. They're in a hedge behind her, so they don't know she's there.
Uh-huh.
And Wentworth is saying to Louisa, "Your sister Henrietta is too easily persuaded. Right? Um, you have more decision and firmness." He says, "It's the worst evil of too yielding and indecisive a character that no influence over it can be depended upon." This is on page 81. "You are never sure of a good impression being durable. Everybody may sway it. Let those who would be happy be firm." And then he gives this wonderful little image. Maybe if I have to pick a passage. I love the nut, right? He picks up the hazelnut, which in possession of all the happiness that a hazelnut can be supposed capable of, which is a great line. But like that's another really interesting conversation. So who is speaking to whom and for whom and why? Like, at one level, Wentworth is speaking to Louisa,
Mhm.
obviously.
Mhm.
Um, but we know, although he can't, he's also speaking for Anne,
Mhm.
who hears these words and presumably applies them to herself, right? Um, He's not really speaking, I don't think, for Louisa. We're even told in the next paragraph that this kind of blows over her head. She's wowed by his manner and elegance, but she has nothing to say. Uh,
Mhm.
she doesn't.
Mhm.
She doesn't really get where this has come from. He's sort of speaking for himself, I think. Really, like
Mhm. Yeah. Yeah.
there's a kind of concealed bitterness or regret or disappointment about the past there, right? The past relationship with Anne.
Yes.
It's beneath this. So,
Yeah,
who's speaking to whom and for whom and why? And that's just
he's also trying to convince himself
yep,
that I'm right, and she should have been more firm. But
yes.
then guess what? That firmness quality is exactly the quality that does not come out to be as great as he thought it
Mhm,
was in the
mhm.
end, right?
That's right.
This is how you do when you feel like, "Oh, they blew it,"
Yep.
and I know better because 'cause I'm a firm character, and everybody should have a firm character, and that's how you're happy. Well, no, not necessarily,
And
right?
it's the same that same chapter has the reference to the Eliot pride,
Yes.
and it has that the paragraph we already looked at, her second interpretation where she thinks she understands him and he's disappointed in her.
Mhm.
So
Yeah.
there's just so many things in that chapter, I think. I really enjoyed that chapter that kind of invite us to think about who's getting what right, who's interpreting what correctly,
Yes.
um, whether they even know themselves very well, right?
Right. Whether they even know themselves very well or they think really fine of the best parts of their character, like, they have a high view of the maybe not so great parts of their character,
Yeah.
right? We all do. Because every type of character that there can be, the firm, the persuadable, whatever, there's virtues and vices, right, with both of those things, and you don't get to sit there and say, "Yeah, only firm people can be happy." You get to say that, and so it's also possible that Captain Wentworth has some things he has to learn, and maybe part 2, to be worthy of being married to Anne, you know, and maybe that's part of what Austen is playing around with as well. So,
Mhm.
well, good. Do we have any final things that we need to talk about that we didn't get to before we shut down our conversation?
think we covered most of the ground we had in mind, unless
Yeah.
people who are listening and watching wanted to throw any last questions into the chat, we could take something quickly.
Yeah. Yeah, oh, and it's funny that, the the scene that you were reading where she's in the hedge, which is such a Shakespeare thing, like, I'm in the hedge listening, overhearing, people talk about me, and the way that she tells her, it tells herself that it was okay that she was listening. Right, do you remember this? This is at the bottom of 82. The sounds were retreating, and Anne distinguished no more. Her own emotions still kept her fixed. She had much to recover from before she could move. The listener's proverbial fate was not absolutely hers. She had heard no evil of herself, but she had heard a great deal of very painful import. She's just like, "Well, I didn't get the fate that, I probably should have deserved where somebody, I overhear somebody telling what they really think, about me." But I just thought that was
Yeah.
funny.
She got let off easy.
Yeah, she got it let
Yeah.
off. Yeah.
Well, good. Well, so thank you, Christina. We can do this, on the Google Meets format, right?
Yes, we will do, the next thing that we'll do with where you can see our faces will be when, we have a Google Meet, and I think we scheduled that for when? July
I wanna say July 30th, but I
30th.
would need to double check to be certain, but
Yeah, and again, that could change, but more than likely, that will be the date of that, and the time has not been fixed yet. We're trying to do it so that people in, Europe who might be, interested, going to that meeting, because typically I've done those in the evenings, because most of my subscribers are Americans, but because we're doing this British novel, we're gonna probably do it in the afternoon as well, just to give some subscribers who are in Europe the chance to join. But that will be when you can see us in, face to face, ask us questions, give your comments, um, and we will be inviting you to that. Mhm.
sounds good.
All
Well,
right. All right.
thank you, everyone. Christina, thanks. Look forward to
All right.
doing it again.
All right. Bye,
Okay.
y'all.
Bye-bye.